I am so lucky to have amazingly supportive and helpful people around me in my life, and in this case especially, thank you Yelena and Vladimir for donating to me this giant roll of white fabric. Turns out they had it donated to them a while ago as well, and that was exactly what I needed for look number 6, so thank you so much. You saved me a bunch of money and left me even more room for experience. At this point, I had already made 2 different samples of the lapel area and decided to move on to making a pattern piece on paper instead of actually trying to make it on a freeform on the mannequin. That wasn't working out for me that well, so I decided to test a different approach. I made a first mock-up out of some random fabric that was lying around the atelier, and I tried the method of actually working around on the stand and creating the collar and lapels, and I'm not too happy with it because it pokes up from the back and doesn't really stand the way I want it to. So after that I made another sample and tested it with white colours. This one is my 3rd sample actually, and I think I'm quite happy with it. It's a reverse version of what colours it's going to be. So this will be white and this will be grey with my print. But because I've tested it for the 3rd time now and I used a pre-made pattern, made a pattern on paper and then I tested it out and kind of changed it along the way, I'm quite happy with the way those sit. I initially wanted those lapels to be way wider, but because I'm cutting it out from a straight piece of fabric and I don't want to add any additional pieces, I had to compromise with kind of a bit more narrow lapels. I think it's not that bad, especially because I'm going to have way more action going on and this will be sort of like a subtle hint to it being a bit more formal, and I think I'm quite happy with it. Like, I'm going to have to adjust things. Obviously it's not finished perfectly, and especially in this area you can see I attached it in a wrong formation, but it doesn't really matter. I'm going to change a lot of things anyway. I wanted to have a full lining on the back. I didn't want any seams to be visible, but now I'm thinking it actually is possible. Well, the lapels are not usually connected to the whole main lining. Usually the lining continues up until this point typically, and then a different kind of lining happens. So that may be the way I can remedy this and actually have the lapels extend way beyond this little thingy. I think it could be pretty cool because on my sketch in here you can see that the lapels are folding on themselves and creating this sort of like a paper twisting effect. So I'm thinking I'm going to do another test with my final fabrics and see how they perform. I'm going to test out the extended lapel version and see how difficult that is to construct with those fabrics. Maybe I'll turn this sample later on into a t-shirt. I could add shoulder pads in here and have it finished, and that could be pretty interesting, like a poncho thingy on top. Pretty cool, huh? Autumn is coming to a close, and since I only planned on coming here for 2 weeks in June and I have like linen shorts and thin shirts, I didn't bring any warm clothing about from that black sweater that you see me wear. So I decided to make myself a pair of woolen trousers, which was beneficial in multiple ways. Not only do I have now something warm to wear in the 3-degree weather that Estonia and autumn has to offer, but I also learned a couple of new tricks from Yelena working with wool. This is applicable to all kinds of trousers or skirts that you're trying to attach a waistband to. You're supposed to stretch out the waistband. You have to stretch it out in a curve so that it lies on your hips better and kind of follows the natural line of your waist. Then you are supposed to fuse it with some kind of fusing, but then attach a non-stretchy strip to that main area of the fold. Quite a while ago, my dad and I bought this metal mesh, and it's finally time for me to test it out and start working and incorporating it into my designs. When working with unconventional materials when it comes to fashion, you definitely want to make way more samples than you think you need, because you have to work out all of the kinks of that material and how it behaves with other things that you're using. So in my case, I started bending the edges, the raw edges, as well as I could, because from the get-go I knew that I would have like a hole in the middle for the neckline, and I didn't exactly know how to finish it, and this is still a question now. Like, my dad and I are still trying to figure out the best method of finishing the neckline so it wouldn't puncture the fabric. And so my sampling process began. I at first decided to test out just the lining fabric and the main fabric with a mesh in between the layers. However, that was way too transparent and I knew that I would have to put something in between the layers. So I proceeded on trying multiple tiny different samples because I didn't want to use much fabric. I didn't really have much final fabric, and the mesh I didn't want to waste as well. So I made tiny little samples with different fillers in between the layers, and that was very helpful in determining which method would be the final one. I had to do 7 different tests before I actually could do a final decision on what method works the best. I did the first one without any padding, and as you can see, the front is very visible, the mesh, mesh, and then the backing also is poking through. Besides that, you can also see the seam allowance that I left, so that would not be an option, and I knew that I would have to put some kind of encasing in between the layers. I tested with thin fabric, and that was not ideal as well because it was way too thin, and you could kind of see the metal wire mesh again coming through the layers, so that was not an option. Tested with white felt, with some sort of blue sponge that the sewing studio had, with yellow sponge, which is a bit too yellowish, and if you put the two next to each other you can kind of see the tonal difference, neither of which were the ideal scenario for me. Then I tested with padding, and that made it a bit too bulky, and especially when you have such a giant thing as my blank, it's going to be a bit too thick for my liking. And then I tested with grey brown felt, and at the end I decided that the white felt was the most ideal option because it gives no thickness whatsoever. So the two sponges, besides the color difference, they're a bit too three-dimensional as well, and the brownish felt that the sewing studio had was pretty great, and I actually didn't really mind the color, but they did not have enough of it, so I would have to buy it anyways, and I had no idea where I could find that brownish natural felt, so I had to go for the white one. And today I just came back from Carnalux and I bought 6 meters of that white felt. With all that in mind, it was time to move on to my final sample. For your work as well, I suggest if you're making something very experimental and your first tester sample that you deem successful is very small, you try and make a larger scale version of that successful sample, because sometimes if you're going very large scale, your tiny sample might look very different and perform very differently. You just want to oversample, because there's no such thing as oversampling, and this way you'll be setting yourself up for success, in my opinion at least. So this is my final test of look number 6, and look, it holds up. What I'm also thinking is, what if this was also some kind of leg structure? It's probably not for this degree collection, maybe an extension of it, but it is pretty interesting the way it holds up on the body and the way it stands. Like, imagine me just walking by with this thing being the side of it. Perhaps not this exact way, I'm not sure, there are not lapels and here is the correct option. However, that could be a pretty interesting way of sort of like imitating the tearing, as if you were tearing through the blank, and maybe from the front you would just see this as like a middle point of the body, so that would be like a very long extension. Left side of the body could be something pretty plain, or on the opposite, like all filled with a bunch of sort of like paperwork. And imagine if this is whole like paperwork, a bunch of papers, and this side is just your nude leg, for example, with nothing on it. I don't know. Or, oh, I think it could be pretty cool if this leg was just a legging with a print of my blank on it. Can you imagine? Okay, the fabric print is unrolled and there is no going back. I have to start now. Like a proper Christian girl, I have my knees bruised, but in my case it's because I was kneeling on a tiled floor trying to cut my lining fabric. The pattern for this look is essentially a rectangle, so there is almost no waist apart from that little teardrop shape that I cut from the middle, and that I'm definitely going to reuse, probably for some kind of bra or like a boob around situation. Like in every project that I ever make is very focused on boobs, so we'll see, I'll reuse it there. As you can imagine, working with 12 meters of fabric connected in the middle is not the comfiest. Another fun sewing tip that I learned from the atelier was using transparent nail polish for the raw sharp edges. I have a very sharp pointed teardrop shape cut out from the middle of my blank, and there was no way for me to finish it perfectly. Even though I tried to stitch it as close to the edge as possible, I still had some gapping, so I kind of added a little bit of that nail polish and sewed it close, and also did a bit of like felting technique so that I could kind of encase all of the raw edges. Thanks to those 7 tests that I did, I determined that white felt was the best option for this look, so I grabbed it from Carnolux and I had to piece it together. The width of that felt was 90 centimeters, and because my fabric is 150, I had to cut multiple pieces of that felt and then attach it on a zigzag. But I finally got to work around on an industrial zigzag, so that was kind of exciting. Industrial zigzag has 2 functions for you to adjust. First, larger wheel is adjusting the width of your zigzag, and the smaller one is the frequency of your stitch. I started a new IGTV series called Design Decisions with an aim to showcase all of the knowledge that I've gained from my university over the past 4 years. And the first episode focusing around gathering is already out now. I showcased 5 different methods of doing that technique, and if you're interested, go head over to my Instagram to follow that and the design journey and behind the scenes photos of the whole process as well. Thank you for watching, see you next time, bye!